This is Rob Sheffield, and you're listening to Everything Fab Four on Salon.com.
Welcome to Everything Fab Four, a podcast focused on fun and intelligent stories about the Beatles. I'm your host, Ken Womack, music culture columnist for Salon.com and a Beatles scholar and historian. No other band, or popular phenomenon for that matter, has enjoyed the global impact the Beatles have and continue to have more than 50 years later. They are part of our human fabric. They created music that continues to bring people together, and just about everyone has their own Beatles story to tell, some that are surprisingly deep and unexpected. This show seeks to draw those stories out in interesting and insightful ways. Remember, it's a Beatles world, and everyone has a story.
I feel like when you're a little kid, you like Ringo. He's your favorite Beatle. And then when you're an angsty teenager, John is your Beatle. And then when you're kind of doing your spiritual searching, in your 20s, George is your Beatle. And then when you have a wife and kids, Paul's your Beatle.
Today's guest is American filmmaker Morgan Neville. He is the director behind the 2014 film 20 Feet from Stardom, which won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature, as well as a Grammy Award for Best Music Film. His documentary, Best of Enemies, on the debates between Gore Vidal and William F. Buckley, was shortlisted for the 2016 Academy Award and also won an Emmy Award. Neville's 2018 film, Won't You Be My Neighbor, about legendary television host Fred Rogers, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival to rave reviews and focuses on the power that kindness and understanding can have in a community, whether real or imagined. It became the highest-grossing biographical documentary of all time. Neville has been nominated for 5 additional Grammys for his films, including Respect Yourself, The Stax Record Story, Muddy Waters, Can't Be Satisfied, Johnny Cash's America, and The Music of Strangers, Yo-Yo Ma and the Silk Road Ensemble. Neville's other films include The Cool School, Shotgun Freeway, Keith Richards' Under the Influence, and, as producer, Miss Americana, Beauty is Embarrassing, and Crossfire Hurricane. Neville's films frequently focus on culture, especially contemporary music. Speaking about his 2016 film, The Music of Strangers, Neville said that the best thing about it for me, as a filmmaker, is that not only do I get to indulge my musical love, but that music is, to me, the most amazing Trojan horse to tell any other kind of story. The best music films are not about music. Music is just the language we're speaking to tell a story about culture. Neville's most recent film is Man on the Run, the story of Paul McCartney's post-Beatles comeback in the 1970s. The documentary will be released in select theaters February 19th and 22nd, and then released on Amazon Prime Video on February 27th. Welcome, Morgan. When did you discover the Beatles?
My dad was a big rock fan. My dad had seen the Beatles in Indianapolis in 1964. And we had a jukebox in our house, and we had Beatles 45s in it. I mean, it was just there from the very beginning. And so my dad encouraged all of that. I think he took me to my first Beatles fest when I was 11. So it's really something that I feel like I've been preparing for this literally for my whole life.
Were there any key moments or songs or albums that became important to you? Other than all of them?
Yeah, I know. I mean, it's interesting because one of the great things about the Beatles catalog is, depending on where you are in your life, different parts of it pop out in relief and kind of speak to you in some way, and then they recede, and so you go through waves where suddenly different parts of the catalog speak to you, and just like different Beatles speak to you in a way. I mean, I was just thinking about this, that in a way, I feel like when you're a little kid, you like Ringo. He's your favorite Beatle. And then when you're an angsty teenager, John is your Beatle. And then when you're kind of doing your spiritual searching, in your 20s, George is your Beatle. And then when you have a wife and kids, Paul's your Beatle.
They really do outfit you for life, don't they? In a way.
They do, in every way, and I never get sick of it at all. I've never been far away from the Beatles, and also, I reading every book and digesting everything is just something that I've always enjoyed doing. So it's amazing how much that prepared me for doing this job.
They're very much like Shakespeare, right? They have all of these characters. They have stories. Their own stories are interesting. The music, the albums are all of these individual journeys, like the plays. It's just overwhelming enough to be a kind of lifelong pursuit.
It is. And, as soon as you think, oh, surely there isn't anything else to know about this story, something else reveals itself. I feel that way about all great art. I mean, whether it's, Beethoven or Picasso or whatever, it's like it grows with you. It has dimensions that just keep unlocking themselves as you age through life. And then, you find yourself back at the beginning, suddenly you're back kind of loving, the simple early Beatles, or whatever, I mean, that's when I have my own kids. Suddenly it's like, oh, I'm back at being a kid again, listening, introducing them to all that music and kind of loving it all over again.
The mystery that I think is at the heart of the story for me, not the story, but the music that keeps me coming back, is how the hell is the same band that made She Loves You the same group that will roll into making the White Album and Abbey Road? I mean, we know intellectually they're the same people.
Mm-hmm.
It's only a few years later.
Well, that's the time horizon on the Beatles. If you really look at it, it's insane, and just thinking about, like, with Paul particularly, he was 27 when the band broke up. So think about where we all were, most of us, when we were 27. We hadn't already completed anything like the Beatles. I mean, the amount of growth, the amount of creativity, it's just something that it's hard to think of anything else that's a precedent for that. Just
I can't find it. Yeah, I look.
No.
I mean, you mentioned Picasso. No. James Joyce. No. Did you play any instruments when you were growing up? Was there any sort of music side of your life in that way?
Oh, yeah. I played piano, and then I started guitar when I was 13 and played in bands, and, always loved playing music. And I've made music films for a lot of my life, in part because I'm a music nerd who found it a very convenient career to have, to make music films, because it legitimized my nerddom. But also I feel like, filmmaking is very rhythmic and very musical. And I think the way I like to approach music and film is that the music isn't just there as wallpaper or even just there as score. The music is the story. This isn't behind the music. It's like the music is the thing, And so the more I've always kind of looked at how to connect music or song with story and character, And when you're dealing with songwriters, particularly, it's right there on the surface to figure out, because they're telling you how they're feeling through their art, So just letting the music help tell the story. And often when I start a film like this one, I actually work on a soundtrack before I've started the film. And
So do you mean like you pick some selections that are going to...
Well, I think about it this way, like if I was just to try and tell a story, in this case, the story of McCartney in the 70s, through his songs alone, how would I do that? With what he was saying, or what he was, and that could be saying literally lyrically, or it could be saying musically. And it's just an exercise for remembering that the music is a tool to help tell that story. And of course it changes and everything else, but I always find it really useful just to think about that. And often then I start to think about, how I could use this song in this way, or, I can make a moment out of this. It's just, it kind of helps it stew in the back of my brain. And that's the fun part for me.
So back in the 70s, right, when you were going to Beatles fests, etc., what an incredible age for film. Were there any influences that you call back on from that period? I think about the 70s a lot. I think we're both just old enough to have experienced them in some regard, and it was such a different organic period than just about anything else.
It was, I was born in 1967, and the Beatles were all still putting out records when I came into consciousness, and I remember all that. But also my dad, in addition to imbuing me with the love of the Beatles, imbued me with the love of cinema, and took me to so many movies he probably shouldn't have. And I actually just made a film for Netflix called Breakdown 1975 that just came out, kind of about American cinema in the mid 70s in America. So it's my favorite period of cinema.
It's an incredible, just rich age.
And part of it is both the kind of formal experimentation, the ambiguity, the intelligence of it. It really challenges you as a viewer to kind of lean in. And it's interesting. We live in a time now where, through social media and how our brains have been, gamified by everything, where people don't want you to ask so much from somebody watching something. It's like, make it easy. They may be on their phone while they're watching. They may do whatever, that this idea that we should spoon feed, and that's kind of the opposite of what I like to do in film, because of the films I grew up loving. But it's something I think I've done in my documentaries, is that I really want you to be an active viewer. I want you to bring yourself to the movie and fill in parts of it, because I'm not going to connect every dot for you.
Well, and you shouldn't have to. In this day and age, I know from the courses I teach in university life, I mean, students are capable of understanding amazingly complex narrative. They really are. I mean,
I have two teenagers, so I see that they can do it. I just think we don't often ask enough of people, because I think when you do it, it's rewarding for you as an audience to watch something, to read a novel, to listen to an album from beginning to end as it was intended to be done. There's a story there, and to engage with things not in bite size, but in full length, full album length. That's the best.
Well, before we talk about Man on the Run, let's talk about your own documentaries. You've got an incredible filmography. What was the big break? What allowed you to create this space, which wasn't your original intention
Well,
in life,
you
I
know,
guess.
I've been making documentaries, God, for over 30 years.
Right.
And in the beginning, people didn't care. And it's not that they didn't care about my documentaries. They didn't care about documentaries at all,
Yeah.
period.
Right. When we were growing up in the 70s and 80s, this was not a thing.
No, it was not a thing. And there was no clear path even to figure out how do you even be a documentary filmmaker. And I think if for people living in New York, there were the Maisels and a few people that had offices where people would intern and learn, and I think a lot of, documentary classes in film school were almost more like visual anthropology or something, but it wasn't. But the films that started popping out that really sparked me were everything from Sherman's March to Roger to When We Were Kings to, Theremin, all these films that were just doing something different. And I started making a documentary, when I was 20. I was a journalist out of college, but then when I was 25, I started a documentary and instantly knew it's what I loved. But I always had this love of culture and particularly music. And I just thought, well, that's a corner I can own for a while. I can just, work on that. And I've made films. I did a lot of PBS documentaries on Muddy Waters and Hank Williams for American Masters and things like that. But the real breakthrough for me, career-wise, was 20 Feet from Stardom, a documentary about backup singers, which was kind of a breakthrough for documentaries too. It was one of those films that crossed over in a way to a bigger audience rather than what was kind of the documentary ghetto at the time. And what documentary is now versus it was, for the first 10 years of my career, is so different. It's so different. And I think it's both the audience has changed. There was always kind of like a documentary is like the spinach you're supposed to eat or something.
Yeah, you don't want too many vitamins, all that iron. It's too good for you.
Don't want to do it. But also, I think documentary filmmaking has become way more dynamic too, in terms of what it can do. It's interesting that it's come a long way, and in some ways, maybe come too far.
How's that? We're in a strange place, aren't we?
Yeah, I mean, we could have a very long discussion about this, but there are a lot of things today kind of masquerading as documentary that are not really documentary. Things that are sensationalistic or a little more staged, or a little more controlled, or anything like that. That I don't really think of as documentary, but they all
certainly on the true crime side.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there are good things everywhere, but there are more and more bad things everywhere. So it's a hard thing for people to navigate. It's almost too much. And there's a lot of, streaming has come in such a big way that I think it often rewards the kind of easy watch as opposed to the hard watch. And so, I think my platonic ideal is still having people sit in a dark room together and share the experience of watching something. And we're going to do it. Yeah, we're doing a theatrical globally with this film, Man on the Run, but also doing theatrical runs in a few other cities. So there'll be some chance for you to see on a big screen, which I strongly encourage people to do because it sounds amazing on a big screen.
So this story in particular really is, in a lot of ways, Paul's most interesting story. The Beatles are so monolithic that let's just park them in the legendary parking lot for a moment. the idea of coming back from that with the constraints that existed, right, in the early 70s, the dealing with a very hostile press, and the wounds of no longer having this amazing creative outlet. When he and Mal Evans are crying, in September 1969 in Paul's Garden at Cavendish Avenue, it's about loss, and
It's,
coming back from that loss. So, how did you then frame the story moving forward?
I mean, that, a lot of people, I'm sure yourself included, I'm sure, you watch Get Back most recently, where you kind of get a more dimensional version of snapshot of where they were in 1969, creatively, interpersonally, and it's complicated, and they're all feeling like the end is coming. They all know the end's coming. But being a Beatles, all they had known since they were young teenagers, mid-teenagers. So, they've all been to outer space and back in a way that it's hard to even articulate to anybody else. They've had such a singular experience in, global history to have done what they did and the impact they had and the creativity and everything. And then suddenly it's gone. And there's just that mourning of like, what now? That vacuum left by that, which is impossible. I mean, the shadow the Beatles cast over each of the individual members was inescapable. And going back and certainly looking at every interview Paul gave for the most part, and many of the other Beatles, it was omnipresent. There's no way they could ever talk about anything without the Beatles being brought up, and so, I also think that the public was heartbroken. And in a way, there's a lot of kind of anger from the fans at them in a way, saying, can't you guys just get back together? Yeah, you want to go do this, but it's not as good as what the Beatles had been. And there's just, I think there was actually kind of a hostility from critics, from the public, and a kind of grief from the members themselves. I think John probably embraced the freedom the most in the beginning, and Paul's solution was one that I don't, it's the unlikeliest of solutions, which is I'm going to move to a farm in rural Scotland and shear sheep and mend fences and completely remove myself from the rock and roll life and start having kids right away. So he has Mary in August of 69. The next month, September 69, John says he wants a divorce, and Paul, by the end of September, is in Scotland. And I think it was literally a way of staying grounded, just staying connected to things that were real. A new wife, Linda, kids, a rural life that, nobody treated him special in any way whatsoever. And then the kind of the key for me in figuring out what this film may be about was when he finally released McCartney 1 in the spring of 70. The only interview he did was that written Q&A that he hands out, that you see in the documentary, handed out in front of Apple to journalists. And it's the Q&A where he reveals that the Beatles are no more. That then was attributed to Paul quits the Beatles, but right. It's more complicated than that. But the last question in that Q&A is, well, what are you going to do now that you're not a Beatle? And he said, my only plan is to grow up. And I thought, well, that's an interesting story to tell, because if you've been a famous Beatle since you were 16 or famous since you were 20, how do you, it arrests a lot of things, emotionally arrests, or it kind of freezes you in a kind of an adolescent state. You see this with lots of rock bands. So suddenly it's like, oh, everything else in my life, I need to figure out now, what kind of person am I? What kind of husband? What kind of dad? What kind of artist? And I thought those were the interesting questions that Paul was trying to answer through the 1970s.
But he does it on such an incredible scale, right? I mean, it doesn't start that way in the 1970s, but by the end of it, he's one of the dinosaurs, right? Along with Fleetwood Mac and the Eagles, and of course Elton John, who has an amazing decade. He becomes this megalithic act on his own, with all of those just hits one after another. But there's a kind of combustion, right, that takes place where you can, and I find it interesting when I listen to his music from that period. There's a buildup, right? From those albums as each new one accrues across the 1970s. I don't want to say it feels planned, but
I think it was conscious in the way that he said to me, and it's in the film, that the plan was to begin at square one and get to square 100. And so, because the Beatles had started at square one, and so Paul consciously starts small. McCartney 1, the majority of it is home demos, basically.
Maybe I'm Amazed is the one he took into Abbey Road, because he could tell it's Maybe I'm Amazed.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard other theories about that too, which that John released Instant Karma at the beginning of 1970, and it was the first John single that was could have been a Beatles single. It was like, oh, this is a great song. And it was before the Beatles had publicly broken up, but it was almost like, have they broken up? John puts out this single and performs it on Top of the Pops, and 3 days later, Paul goes into Abbey Road and records Maybe I'm Amazed.
And that's interesting timing.
It is interesting timing. Okay, forget the home demos. You want a Beatles song? You want an anthem for the ages? How about this? And so, but still, he tries things kind of without overthinking them. He forms wings from, not with like a big search for the most perfect musicians, and it's not a super group with anybody you could get on the planet. It's like, oh, I know a guy who plays guitar and he's really good. You should try him out, and everybody just kind of falls in. Oh, Denny, he knows Denny from the Moody Blues. So Denny Lane joins, but it's all very kind of ad hoc. And even their first album, Wildlife, they record kind of in 2 weeks, very
it's almost
loosely.
Like Please Please Me, right? It was just a few hours here and there.
Yeah, it was really loose, and just like, let's not think about this too much, and then the first tour they do is them hopping into a van and driving around England and showing up at universities and saying, hey, can we play a lunchtime show in the cafeteria? That kind of thing. So, and even from there, they started getting offers to go do big tours. And Paul said, no, we're going to do theaters, and then we're going to do arenas, and then just slowly building and building, and consciously not playing Beatles songs for years in the beginning, saying this is its own thing, and really even oftentimes not putting out songs or writing songs that felt too Beatlesy, but trying to kind of find a voice that was different. And so it really builds over years, but I don't, that's not an accident. Paul turned down big offers. He turned down all kinds of things he could have done. I think he really wanted it to evolve. And there were some great things that came out of that, and there were missteps too. But I think what I came to really respect about Paul's kind of creative mind in that time was that the missteps were as important as the hits, you know.
Sure. And when you look at that discography and you see the hits listed, for every one of those, there are at least two or three others that are just magnificent that exist in a different kind of almost anonymity, right? You know, I mean, Good Night Tonight is an amazing song in the late
Love it.
70s, but
Yeah.
you flip that thing over and Daytime, Nighttime Suffering
I love that song too.
is splendid, you know.
Yeah, those are actually two favorite Wing songs that I remember buying the 12-inch.
Same.
Yeah, it had the picture of them in the kind of 1930s tuxes with the slicked hair.
Big microphone. Yeah.
Yep, exactly. And there were so many great songs everywhere. And that was, for me, part of the treat of making the film was, okay, I'm just going to go deep into everything I can get my hands on from that decade. And there's great work, but it's funny because for a number of reasons, I don't think it gets the respect it deserves. Part of it was at the time, Paul, the critics did not like a lot of this music, and we talk about it in the film. Ram was widely panned, and sometimes severely criticized. And I think in the film we quote the review from Rolling Stone magazine that calls it, the nadir of rock and roll, in a review written by John Landau, who went on to work with Bruce Springsteen.
And who goes on to love Band on the Run.
And goes on to love Band on the Run. But, now Ram is on the top 500 albums of all time on Rolling Stone. So there's been a kind of historical reckoning. But I think at the time, Paul just wasn't cool, enough, because he was living on a farm and writing songs about kids and, living in the country and, all these things. In the
heart of the country, no less.
In the heart of the country, so, but those are songs that, again, the older you get, they don't fade away. They're more timeless.
I remember vividly, too, there was this idea that he was somehow bubblegum. And any read of damn near all of his albums from that period and beyond, in any true and authentic listening to those records, you find that there are a lot of very hard rocking guitar songs. I mean, he is, which he proved during his Beatles years. I mean, he rocks as hard as anyone. And in fact, is attracted to that sound, always has been, loves Led Zeppelin, etc. And when I read those reviews and I think about them, I just wonder, did you really listen to this record? Because the electric guitar work in particular, and we know a lot of that great soloing is him and not other members of the band. I think it was a conscious choice to try to portray him that way.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you're right. And, different albums through the 70s, some are harder than others. But there are hard songs, everywhere. And part of it is he had these different lineups too. I think, particularly Henry McCulloch, his first guitarist who had come from Joe Cocker's band, was like a great heavy rock guitarist. I think, and Paul himself, like on Let Me Roll It, that's Paul playing all the guitar, one of the all-time great heavy rockers. Yeah. So it is, but then he'd have a ukulele song, so, and I think it's interesting, even the late 70s stuff, London Town is softer, I would say. And then, Back to the Egg has, Get It On and, a few kind of louder rocking songs on it. But there was actually another mix that Chris Thomas, who had kind of co-produced that album, they had an original version of that album that was kind of rockier, a more rock version that I got to hear. And I hope it gets released because it's really good.
Oh, I do too. I love that record even as it is.
Me too.
That's one of the uneasy things about that period. I mean, obviously Paul McCartney goes on. I would have liked to have seen more of what Wings might have been just a little bit longer. Mm-hmm. I remember being so buoyed by that record when I bought it, with my own allowance and
yeah. And it's staring at that album cover and going, what the hell is going on?
Yeah, what is this? But you know what I mean, right? It would have been, obviously, I suppose the ideas, well, you tell me. I mean, why couldn't Wings go on, do you think?
They could have, but Paul didn't need them, And I think, by Wings Mach 3, the third and final version of Wings, really, which is, with Lawrence Juber and Steve Hawley. And they're great musicians.
They really are. I mean, maybe the best lineup in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, in a musical way, Lawrence Juber was an amazing kind of session player and jazz player and everything. But in a way, almost maybe too good, in a way that they weren't like a rock and roll band. They were like really good session players. And I think, and even, what happens is, they play their last show as part of the concert for Campuchia in December of 79. They go to Japan 2 weeks later, and Paul is busted. And that tour never happens, and Wings never plays another show. Though he doesn't actually break up the band, and even publicly kind of dodges the question for a while, and they recorded some more. They were going to do a kind of odds and sods kind of album. Right. I forget the name of it. It was a clever name.
Lunchbox, Odd Socks, and then there was Ubu Jubu, which came along.
But I mean, my thinking about it a lot for this film, and the reason I call the film Man on the Run is that he's running from that shadow, trying to get away from the Beatles, trying to say I'm something different. I'm my own person. I'm my own artist. Wings is its own band. I'm not going to lean into the Beatles thing, certainly in the beginning, and only a little bit kind of in the middle, doing not even a handful of songs in his bigger tours. And then when John dies, there's no running anymore. I think the idea of, are the Beatles going to get back together? It's over, and he, after this, when he goes to, McCartney tour, essentially demos he did over the summer of 79 that when he gets back from Japan, he immediately starts mixing. And that's successful. But then Tug of War, he's working with George Martin again and, Ringo. And, suddenly he's not running in the same way. He's just saying, well, I can just be Paul.
Everything Fab Four is presented by Salon.com, the premier news, politics, innovation, and arts website. For more information, visit everythingfab4.com, where you can learn more about our podcast and my latest Beatles-related book, Living the Beatles Legend, The Untold Story of Mal Evans. The Everything Fab Four theme song, Seize the Day, is provided courtesy of Black Rabbit, the high-octane Beatles cover band, an innovative psychedelic rock project from Rockaway Beach, Queens in New York City. Like what you heard today on Everything Fab Four? Be sure to subscribe, give us a rating, and recommend the show to your friends. Plus, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter at EF4 Podcast. Distributed by Salon.com, Everything Fab Four is a Wonderwall production. Remember, it's a Beatles world, and everyone has a story.